Well, we could probably do an entire podcast on Bigfoot and have 12 episodes.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we're all into crypto stuff, why didn't we start a crypto podcast instead of
Yeah.
Get some squatchers on.
Welcome to Screens of the Stone Age, the podcast where scientists review movies about prehistoric people. My name is Josh Lindell. I'm a grad student studying Neanderthal teeth, and I'm here with my co-hosts.
I'm Kim Plomp. I am a bioarchaeologist, so I look at human skeletons in the archaeological record.
And I'm Dr. Ross Barnett. I work on paleogenetics, so the DNA of extinct things.
And today we're talking about the movie Missing Link from 2019, I believe.
Yeah.
Starring Hugh Jackman and Zach Galifianakis. Who wants to summarize this movie?
I can.
Okay.
So it's kind of set back in the day when science was purely a old white man's club, like usual with our movies. And there's this scientist explorer guy who, you know, it's kind of the same thing where you have to be rich and be able to just spend your time, a naturalist, be able to spend your time doing this, kind of like Darwin and all that back in the day. So he spends his time trying to prove the existence of, what are the crypto creatures or crypto forms?
Cryptids.
So Nessie, cryptids, yeah. Nessie, Sasquatch, things like that. So it starts with him finding Nessie. And then he receives a letter saying that somebody knows how to find the Sasquatch if he goes to Washington. So he flies to Washington and he finds out that the person who wrote the letter is the Sasquatch because he's lonely. And I got really teary at this because he's the only one left and he has no one to hang out with. So he wants this explorer to bring him to the European yetis because he thinks that those would be his cousins and that he could get along with them and then he would have people to spend time with. And then the explorer wants to do this because he wants to have proof of the Sasquatch because then he can be finally allowed into this scientific, what I took as to be the Royal Society of, like a spoof on the Royal Society of London. But there's a bad guy who's in charge of the Royal Society and he does not want this guy in it for some unknown reason. He just hates him and he doesn't want him there. He doesn't want him to ever have the fame. And so he hires someone to, someone called Stank, which I thought was funny, to follow him around and try and kill him and take the Sasquatch for himself. So they have, are being chased by villains, which is needed in the story. And then finally they make it to the Himalayas where they find the yetis. And the yetis have this beautiful preserved area of land called Shangri-La, but they don't want the Sasquatch, whose name is Susan Link, to live with them because they think he's too different. And then he becomes the explorer guy's assistant.
That's pretty much it, isn't it?
Yeah, I laughed, I cried. I liked it.
I'm happy that we're doing a Bigfoot movie because I love anything to do with Bigfoot.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, and I'm probably one of the few professional scientists that has a peer-reviewed publication that talks about yetis, so that tickles my fancy as well.
Yeah, you should talk about your publication.
I could talk about my publication.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
So, I love kind of crypto stuff. I mean, that's what I used to read about a lot when I was a kid. And I
me too.
haven't really grown out of it. I think it speaks very much to the kind of budding scientist that, you've got questions and you want to find answers. Maybe some of those answers aren't particularly right, but you've got to have that kind of questioning attitude to want to get involved in science.
Well, that's what I find so funny is all the conspiracy theorists believe in this and they believe they have evidence and they say that the academics and the scientists are lying and they're keeping it secret and they don't we so desperately want this stuff to be real. Yeah. We want to find it too. It's not that, it's not that we don't want the Sasquatch to be real.
Yeah. Anyone that found a Sasquatch, they'd be, Nobel Prizes, Nature papers, you name it.
Nature papers. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, I mean, I've always loved that kind of stuff, and especially, growing up in Inverness near the Loch Ness monster exhibition and all that kind of stuff. It's been a big influence. But anyway, so this came about because a few years ago now, a guy called Brian Sykes, who was a professor at Oxford University in genetics, he was also interested in these kind of questions, and he like went about collecting and getting people to send him physical evidence of Himalayan yetis. So where people had claimed they'd seen yetis and they'd left behind bits of hair or scat or whatever, he kind of collected up all these bits of, hair samples and stuff and used molecular biology techniques to try and get DNA out of them. So a lot of them were like things like hairs from goats or dogs or people or nothing, like just lint essentially. But a couple of them came back as bears, which is great. I mean, that makes sense. There's bears native to the Himalayas. Bears sometimes walk around on their hind legs. They can look like a kind of humanoid anthropoid ape from a distance. But the big buzz he got from this study was that in his analysis of one of the hairs that they'd collected, the claim was that they belonged to a polar bear, and their closest kind of match genetically was to a polar bear that went extinct in the Ice Age. So the kind of idea that there was extinct Ice Age polar bears wandering around in the Himalayas, masquerading as yetis, kind of got quite a lot of press. And so the kind of paper came to my attention, and I downloaded the data from this original paper, which was in a reasonable journal in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B. But because of the way that kind of DNA studies work, whenever you generate a paper that uses DNA data, you have to upload it to a central repository called GenBank. So, I mean, this is how science should work. Other scientists should be able to check the data you've generated, which is what we did. And Brian Sykes was as happy about that as anyone. So we downloaded the data, and unlike what it said in the paper, it wasn't the closest match to this other Ice Age polar bear. But what it looked like most was DNA from a Himalayan brown bear that had become damaged. So, a lot of work done in ancient DNA has shown that over time DNA changes in kind of ways that are easy to estimate, easy to account for, or at least they're kind of predictable ways that the DNA breaks down. And so, coming from an ancient DNA background, myself and co-author Kervin Edwards, we knew about this and were able to account for it. And that kind of laid to rest the kind of ghost of polar bear yetis in the Himalayas. It was just another brown bear with that had its DNA damaged when it was sequenced. So that's the story of that. I mean,
you even got a shout out at last podcast on the left. They discuss your paper.
Yeah, I remember you sent that to me. I mean, I guess that's a thing in Canada. I'd never heard of that before, but it's all good.
I think it's pretty big in North America. It's a popular podcast.
Yeah, it's definitely, if I ever have to kind of in a talk give some kind of background information, then that's one of the things I always like to talk about, because we're a very select group of professional scientists that have Yeti papers.
So I'm definitely familiar with the Sykes paper, but what can you tell me about Melba Ketchum's Sasquatch Genome Project? What do you know about that?
Oh, nothing good. Yeah, I mean, where do you want to start? How much time do we have? I mean, it's just kind of fractally wrong. Like there's not a scale you can look at that and not find massive issues in it. And the deeper you go, the more wrong it gets. So yeah.
So that's like my thing is I'm not a DNA guy, so I've read that whole paper a couple of times. It's a long paper.
Do you want to explain what it is?
So Melba Ketchum, in 2013, I believe this was, she had a team where they were doing the same thing as Sykes, where they were sampling all different kinds of hair and tissue and stuff that was supposed to be Bigfoot and trying to figure out what it actually was. But unlike the Sykes paper, they found that a lot of them were Bigfoot, which, I mean, first of all, you can't say it's Bigfoot because we don't have Bigfoot DNA for comparisons. So they found something that was not an obvious match to any other known animal, except that all the mitochondrial DNA was human and all the nuclear DNA was also human, except that they said there were some specific mutations which were not known amongst humans. And their conclusion was that all of them were from Bigfoot, and that Bigfoot was a hybrid of human women specifically, because it was entirely human mitochondrial DNA, which is only passed from down the maternal lineage. So it was a hybrid of maternal women and an unknown hominid that had somehow survived. And so all of the Bigfoots that they sampled were a hybrid between a different, not Bigfoot, ape and human women. But the human so the part that I can criticize easily is the human mitochondrial DNA comes from all different haplogroups across the world. So somehow you have a population of European and Asian and African and Native American women contributing to this gene pool, which I just can't imagine how you get that group together to form the origin of a hybrid species.
They're just some Casanova Bigfoot traveling the world with his harem. Oh,
Yeah.
Well, now, thanks. Now I know the plot of my next book.
Yeah, it's really weird because I think my understanding is Dr. Ketchum has a background in kind of forensic genetics. So this is not somebody that's untrained. But it's been ages since I read the paper, but it just seemed, it was so sloppy that the stuff was, we kind of have an understanding of hybridization in hominids from studies of Neanderthals and Denisovans. So we know that those kind of things go on, but we also have an equivalent sort of standard of proof for those kind of massive, big kind of studies and ideas. And, there's a lot that was wrong in the Ketchum work. The kind of the standards of sterile and careful work weren't really adhered to. The kind of assumptions made were huge and not controlled for. The conclusions were kind of blown out of all proportion. And so I think the only kind of explanation is that, these are just really bad science that was being done. And they were getting human DNA, understandably, but they were getting all sorts of things like contaminants and jumping PCR, which is a known artifact of PCR work, where you get really bizarre hybrid fragments because you have contaminants in there and the polymerase kind of jumps between strands. So, nobody takes it seriously. And the paper itself, I think, was only published because Ketchum and her co-authors bought a kind of journal and then released it. So, it's not even peer-reviewed. You can't publish a paper in your own journal and say it's science. That's just not how it works.
Yeah, no.
To this day, I think it's the only paper that journal has ever published. The journal is called De Novo.
Yeah.
Well, I'm definitely going to go read that. But it's worrisome. All joking aside, it's worrisome that this comes from a forensic DNA expert. And just hopefully that the forensic work that they're doing is far better, because that's that's affecting actual life, right?
Yeah. Yep. It's just a bit of a mess. And
but when you want something to be true,
exactly, and that just shows that the easiest person to fool is yourself, and that's really why the kind of whole edifice of science is there, for other people to kind of say, well, hold on a second, you think that sounds great, but we think that's that's a complete pile of bull crap. And without that kind of check, it's not science. It's just stories.
Yeah. So the main hypothesis for what Bigfoot is like Gigantopithecus, right? Which is a 6 foot tall ape from, I know it's prehistoric, but what timeline is? I should have.
So Gigantopithecus is kind of mid Pleistocene-ish, Southeast Asian.
Okay, yeah.
But it's a relative of the orangutan, and it's not very well known from fossils. There's like jaws and teeth, and that's about it.
Yeah.
And since orangutans and pongoods have never been found in North America, let alone any other of the kind of great apes, it's kind of a massive biogeographical problem. I would love Sasquatch to be real, but if he's been there, if he's a real kind of biological creature, then you'd expect, fossils of his ancestors would have been found. We have kind of fossils of every other creature's ancestors that kind of currently lives in America, from bison to bears to saber-toothed cats to raccoons. All these other things have left a trail in the fossil record. Why haven't Sasquatch?
Yeah. Well, and we're encroaching more and more into nature, so there would be more and more proof anyways.
Yeah, that's something that's really nicely expressed in Missing Link in the film, and I took a note of it, where he says the human world gets bigger and mine gets smaller. That was
I know.
quite a sad thing for him to have to say, but it's it's true.
Yeah, really sad. But again, to have a population we've discussed this a few times in different episodes. To have a population of living organisms, it has to have a certain size to be able to keep it going for generations. So for it to be a large enough population to keep Bigfoots going, it would be visible. We would know about it.
Is it Bigfoot or is it Big Feet? Do we have a kind of correct plural for a group of Sasquatch?
Bigfoots.
I think the consensus is Bigfoots.
Bigfoots, okay.
So maybe let's stick to our usual format and start off with nitpicking mistakes and inaccuracies. I gotta say, this movie had a lot of attention to detail, and I was really impressed. I didn't find a lot to nitpick, so the ones I've got are really pedantic. Do you guys have anything to say about that?
Well, mine is just the overall, again, we've talked about this before, is the idea of a missing link to begin with, which there's no missing link. And then the idea that Bigfoot would be our missing link. No one has ever made that suggestion that Bigfoot would be
I think a lot of people have probably made that suggestion.
Have they? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, not in the serious stuff that I read about it. Yeah. That it would be a step in human, like modern human evolution. So a step on our lineage leading up to us. So that was a problem, but I could see how they just made a cute movie with that.
I think they kind of sidestepped that quite well, in that they don't really talk a lot about him actually being a missing link. I mean, that's just his name, and he kind of says it as a joke almost.
No, they talk about it. They say that there's pockets that didn't evolve into man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is why the bad guy doesn't want him to find it either, because he is a creationist and he's offended by the idea that humans evolved from apes. So that's the major conflict in the movie.
Yeah. So I mean,
I missed that.
It's quite cool. I mean, the bad guy, voiced by Stephen Fry, he's really good. Stephen Fry should play more baddies, but there's some really fantastic lines that he comes out with, which I took a note of, where he's kind of explaining how he hates the way the kind of modern world is turning, how they've got electricity, suffrage, and evolution, like the kind of three main things he has problems with, which is a really great way of getting a handle on his character. So electricity, women's votes, and evolution are all bad in his view.
This movie did a really good job of commenting on sexism.
Yeah, it did, and even I mean, it's surprisingly deep in terms of, like you say, the sort of dissemination of kind of white guys going over places and discovering stuff that people already know about, kind of just taking things and not giving anything back. But it's very kind of openly critical of that, which is great. Yeah, which is nice. You don't really expect that from a kids movie, but it does in a very good way.
The thing that I love the most, if we can just jump to the very end of the movie, is that the one female, again, the only, well, I guess there was the in Nepal or in Tibet there was females, but the one like female that follows throughout the movie is the love interest of this guy. And at the end, she goes off on her own. He doesn't get her, right? She's like, no, I gotta go have my own adventures. I don't need either of you. I love that. She wasn't like the prize at the end.
Yeah, no, it was great.
But for pedantic things, I would say that what annoyed me was the first scene where they find Nessie, and she comes up behind them, and he throws a rope on her and then pisses her off and then tries to take a picture, and then it ends up the camera gets broken because she's angry and breaks the camera. But you're like, she was being cool. Why didn't you just take the picture? Like, why? He was the jerk. Yeah. If he was just nice to her and treated her with respect, I'm assuming Nessie's a girl here. I don't know why. Then he probably could have gotten a picture and it would be all fine.
Yeah, I think speaking as a Highlander, I had a lot to nitpick with the first sort of Nessie scene. I
don't know why they made her look so silly. They had the body of a plesiosaur.
Yeah.
And then her head was like a brachiosaur.
It was quite weird. I mean, it looked like they made her head just so that it would be hookable by the rope that they threw. I mean, that seemed to be the only reason they made the head that shape.
Well, and I think so that her eyes and her nose could be outside the water without anything else. Which I guess would be smart, but she looked silly.
But yeah, it was quite, the idea that you had to entice her in with bagpipes. That I found that quite frankly offensive.
I thought it was cute.
But yeah, I mean, there wasn't really a lot because it was kind of its own thing. It didn't really. I mean, it was fairly. It had a fairly good kind of, I thought, attitude towards the idea of evolution. It didn't do anything super wrong. I mean, yes, we know that Bigfoot and Yetis aren't some kind of halfway house between kind of apes and humans, but I don't think it really dwelt on that. It was more interested in finding them as, a branch of the human family tree and what they could tell us about our own humanity, which I thought was quite a good kind of way of explaining it in the film. I didn't really find many issues. No.
Plus, it's set in the 1800s, so the theory of evolution was still in a very formative period. Yeah. So if they don't have the evolution correct, that's not really that bad.
Yeah.
So here's what I got for you. Did you catch what year this movie is actually set in?
No, but
they would have been
show
after Darwin because they had the Descent of Man on his wall, right?
And they also, I mean, they could date. They have like the Statue of Liberty being built in the background in some of the scenes.
Exactly. So they don't say what year it is, but we can pinpoint this. So the Statue of Liberty is being built, which puts it in 1885 or 1886. Okay. Very securely. And so I use that as my starting point here to look for just any other anachronisms. Okay. And there aren't a lot. Their attention to detail was really good. The first thing is they show a lot of maps because they do that thing where they do the montage and trace their route. Most of the maps are pretty good, except for the map of the United States. It's basically a modern day map, which would almost be accurate for 1885 or 1886, except North and South Dakota are separate states on the map. But in 1886, North and South Dakota would have been a single Dakota territory.
Okay.
And another one is Oklahoma is listed on the map, but in 1886, Oklahoma would have been called Indian Territory because this is where the 5 tribes of the Southeast that were displaced from the Trail of Tears from the 1830 Indian Removal Act. That's where they were all relocated to. So Oklahoma would have been a somewhat unorganized Indian territory. And Oklahoma didn't become a state until 1906. So apart from that, the map of the United States was pretty good. Just those 2 states. When they go to Europe, the map of Europe looks pretty much correct for 1886. It has, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It has They have the map of the Ottoman Empire is essentially correct, except they call it Turkey. I'm not sure if it would have been called the Ottoman Empire or if it would have been called Turkey at the time.
Probably the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, they travel the Suez Canal, which was opened in 1869, so that all checks out.
Cool.
They also have a map of India, which I don't know a lot about Indian territories or borders under colonial rule, but I looked up a map from roughly the time. It seems roughly accurate, so the attention to detail was really good. This is the worst, most pedantic mistakes I could find, really.
Well, they had, for that American map too, I enjoyed that they had all of Canada was just British possession. That's all it was labeled as.
That's right.
But Canada was a country at that point, so I guess...
I didn't notice that part.
Well, you did or didn't?
I didn't. I didn't see a map of Canada, so
it was just
I must have missed that scene.
It was just on top. It wasn't a map. It was just like a blank. So there was the map of the states, and then on top it was just like a blank outline that just said British possession in the huge letters.
1885, Manitoba would have been a province because that was 1870. What about further west? When did British Columbia and Alberta become provinces?
You guys are failing your Canadian citizenship right now.
Hey, I know my American geography better than Canadian.
It is very Canadian to fail our Canadian citizenship.
That's right. I mean, that's how they accept you, if you can get it wrong.
What would I Google for that? British Columbia starts?
When did British Columbia become a province? I'm sure it was late 1800s. It was probably around this time.
1870.
Oh, I've got one potential gaffe that I can maybe talk about while Kim's looking that up. So when they're in his office, which is really quite a cool office.
I know, I wanted that office.
Sir Lionel Hunt, was it his name? Anyway, whatever. For the Hugh Jackman character, he has a stuffed dodo in his office,
yes,
which is quite
I noticed
prominent,
that too.
which is cool, but there are no stuffed dodos. So there's only like one bit of soft tissue of a dodo, which is a head and a neck, which is in the Oxford Museum of Natural History, not on display. And anywhere you see a stuffed dodo in a museum, it's a fake made from swan feathers or other feathers and clay, because there just are no stuffed dodos. The Oxford one was at one stage whole, but it was removed in the, I think, 18th century and partially destroyed, and just the head and foot were kept. So, I mean, it's kind of not really a nitpick. I mean, if there's a stuffed dodo in his office, then it's not a real one. It must just be a fake. But there you go.
Well, there is also, because the bad guy, the Stank, he kills the thing. So that was his, like, he hunts these cryptids. That was his thing. And then Frost doesn't hunt them. He likes to research them, right?
Yeah.
He only wants evidence of them. So I thought that having the dodo stuffed in his office was quite, like, perhaps it was kind of a thing a nod to how the dodos went extinct because of humans doing what Stank would have done, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good point. But no, yeah, I mean, I think the film itself, the animation was incredible. The kind of stop motion stuff
it was so
the
good.
Leica film studio does is brilliant. I've seen the other ones like Paranorman and the Box Trolls, and they're fantastic as well.
Well, and the comedy was really good. Susan was so funny.
It's funny. It really was funny.
When they were like, when Frost was like, "But you always know home is here" or something, and he points to Susan's chest, and Susan's like, "My nipple?"
Yeah.
So funny.
I kind of like that because they explain that he learned English from mostly from reading.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes sense, like, just from personal experience learning languages. It's one thing to learn the language, but like it's getting the idioms and the stuff like that is the really hard part. So Susan understands English, but he takes everything literally.
Yeah.
He doesn't understand sarcasm or common expressions.
Yep.
And a lot of the comedy comes from that, like where he kind of throws the rope over the wall, and instead of like holding on to one end, he throws the whole thing over, and all those kind of gags are just really, or crack open the window and he kind of puts his fist through the glass. I mean, that's just really funny.
Or when he has to take the safe and Frost is like, pick up the safe and throw it through the window, and it's too heavy, so he's just pushing it with making all that noise. Yeah, it's good. Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
So, typically, I just find period movies from the Victorian era to be just horribly boring, and the only exception is movies about naturalists. And I'm really fascinated by these naturalists from this period. Just as a scientist, because, like, I mean, so many things are discovered, and like the work we do now is so detail oriented and minute. Like, I'm studying the roots of molar teeth of Neanderthals. Like, it's so specific that, like, it's hard to get people excited about that kind of work. But 150 years ago, during this Victorian period where we have naturalists and explorers, unfortunately through colonial expansion, finding all these different countries and different animals that people had just literally never seen before in Europe. I think that this is why Bigfoot and other cryptids are so fascinating today, because it's the idea that there's something out there that we don't know about, but that was like the entire world during this period. So explorers would go out and discover new animals that were unknown to Europe, and they would come back with a specimen or sometimes just a story, and they would tell people about these things. And it just must have been such a fascinating time for science, just to have this idea that the world was so big and there were so many unknown things. Mm-hmm. And this movie, I saw real parallels to the quote unquote discovery of the gorilla during this period. And I feel like finding the gorilla, for like Europeans finding the gorilla, must have felt as crazy as us thinking about finding Bigfoot today,
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. And it's also, mountain gorillas are only identified by Westerners in like 1901, 1902, something like that. So,
yeah,
the idea that our kind of largest, closest relatives were still unknown to Western science so late is kind of quite crazy when you think about it. But yeah.
Even the like just gorillas in general were almost entirely unknown to Europe until 1847-ish, when the first skull was brought to Europe. And then until like for the next several decades, they just have stories from explorers who describe them as like hairy giant monsters. And the first live gorilla, actually, they tried to bring captive gorillas to Europe a few times, but they always died on the voyage. The first live gorilla didn't arrive in Europe until 1876, which is only 10 years before this movie. So if we place this movie in that period, the idea of searching for a giant ape in North America is not crazy at all.
No. My favorite story is the opposite of that, where the guy that invented the microscope. So I forget what he was trying to do, but he invented the microscope, and so then he looked at just pond water and saw all the microorganisms and was like, oh my god, the water is full of monsters. And he wrote to other scientists in London and, explained that if you look really close, the water is full of tiny monsters, and he drew pictures and stuff of them, and they were like, you're crazy, stop writing us. And it took him so long to get somebody out to look and to verify that, yes, it is full of tiny monsters. And just even how crazy that would have been, right? Like, because I think he looked at the water, if I'm correct, I think he looked at the water as an idea of like to see through it, like to make sure that there was nothing in the glass or that would be distorting it, right?
Mm-hmm. That's Leeuwenhoek, the Dutch microscopist. Yeah. I mean, that's all these kind of big advances. They always are met with resistance at first.
Yep.
The kind of three stages classically are, this is ridiculous. I don't believe it. Of course, it's the case. Oh, it was obvious the whole time. It's kind of funny how quickly it goes through those stages with every kind of new groundbreaking discovery.
No, exactly, and that's why people find it hard to realize how much of a genius Darwin had to be, because it's not just coming up with natural selection, but it's coming up with natural selection within the world that he lived in and the environment he was raised in, which was very religious and didn't have very much concept of that, right?
Yeah.
So to come up with it out of nowhere is genius.
But Darwin didn't come up with it out of nowhere, though. The idea of evolution was like, it was in the air for at least 100 years before him.
Evolution, but not natural selection.
Natural selection, yeah. We have, the same story playing out with the discovery of the gorilla, because in the 1850s, right around the same time Darwin was writing his book, this newly found gorilla spawned a feud between Huxley and Thomas Henry Huxley and Richard Owen. Are you guys familiar with that story?
Mm.
No.
Yeah. And I was actually reminded of Huxley as well when Sir Lionel first goes to the Great Men's Club and meets the baddie voiced by Stephen Fry. It very much reminded me of the kind of Huxley-Wilberforce debate, where you have the kind of curmudgeonly stuck in his way creationist on one side and the kind of free-thinking evolutionist on the other side, and how they kind of butt heads. I mean, that's what it reminded me of. When they were talking.
I was thinking about Huxley a lot watching this, and I was kind of wishing we brought him up during the Neanderthal Man, where the mad scientist has all these very poetic insults, and I was thinking about how quotable Huxley is. You guys know some of Huxley's quotes?
No, I don't.
Let me pull one up.
Just
here.
the one that he addressed to Wilberforce in the debates. That's quite a good one.
Yeah. So that quote is, "If the question is put to me, would I rather have a miserable ape for a grandfather or a man highly endowed by nature and possessed of great means of influence, and yet who employs these faculties and that influence for the mere purpose of introducing ridicule into a grave scientific discussion, I unhesitatingly affirm my preference for the ape."
Right, yes, I do know that one. That
sick
one's so
burn.
good. Yeah. Drop the mic.
It gets even worse, because he had comments about, it was Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, that was the guy he was addressing, right?
Yeah.
He had comments after his death, because he apparently died suddenly falling from a carriage due to a head injury. And on that note, he says, "His end has been all too tragic for his life. For once, reality and his brains have come into contact, and the result was fatal."
That is brutal. If the fall didn't kill him, that insult would. I mean, geez.
Yeah. Damn.
Ouch.
And after death, that's harsh.
Huxley was cool. I liked Huxley. He was very, very interesting character.
Yeah, he was.
But you know what? I saw a lot of Richard Owen in the Stephen Fry bad guy in this movie. Richard Owen was he did a whole bunch of things. He's the guy that coined the name dinosaur, I believe, right?
Yeah, I think so.
He also got the funding for the Natural History Museum.
Yep.
He discovered the moa from New Zealand based on small bits of bone. He described a lot of the fossils from Darwin's Beagle expedition. So yeah, he was the main player in Victorian biological science, but also not a very nice guy.
Yeah, there's a lot of quotes about him from Darwin and Huxley and others. But also he was resistant to Darwin's theory of natural selection. He wasn't fully a creationist. Like, he believed in some form of evolutionary change over time, but he was offended by this idea that humans evolved from other primates. He thought that humans might have evolved, but he thought that there was some special class aside for humans. And so this is where the debate between him and Huxley really picks up steam. And so I saw a lot of that debate because a lot of it centered around gorillas, because he thought he could use gorillas, like the differences in brain size between gorillas and humans, to prove that humans could never have evolved from a non-human ape like that.
Just the hippocampus debate that we're talking about.
Yeah, the hippocampus, specifically that there were structures present in the human brain where there's no analog in the non-human ape brain. And so this is the gorilla sort of featured prominently in this feud between Owen and Huxley. And so I wondered how much of this movie was modeled directly after this this feud. And of course, it's not a perfect analogy because the main character, Frost, he's not Huxley at all. And the main bad guy, I mean, they're not modeled to look like any of these characters. So I wondered if it was a coincidence or if they drew heavily, if they were heavily inspired by this feud.
Yeah, it could be.
I would say they're probably inspired. They may have not done like really in-depth research, but I mean, I guess in most disciplines, in the history of most disciplines, there's always a couple of men butting heads throughout.
Yeah. What this film reminded me a bit of, although I guess the kind of plot lines are very different, but have you guys seen The Pirates in an Adventure with Scientists, which is another stop motion film, but it's by Aardman, which is really fun. Maybe we should put it on the list, but it's not got a lot of prehistory in it, but it does have a lot of evolution. So there's one of the characters is Charles Darwin in it, played by David Tennant. Hugh Grant plays a pirate captain called Pirate Captain. And in it they kind of have sort of similar themes of that kind of come up about the sort of same kind of things with Victorian London and great naturalists and hunts for dodos and that kind of stuff.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I want to watch that.
I think it's got a different name in the States. I can't remember what it was called out there. Let me have a look.
Yeah, I've never heard of that movie.
So it was released in North America, Australia, and New Zealand as The Pirates Band of Misfits. But it came out in 2012, so a bit before Missing Link.
Oh, that would have been me writing up my PhD, so
yeah,
I
no
missed
time for
everything
films
that year.
What are you talking about? I'm doing my PhD, and all I do is talk about films with you guys.
Well, Ross and I were sitting in the basement, and with hardly even any windows, so like Armageddon could have happened, and we would have just been listening to music.
Yeah, we would not have known until we got the general email.
Yeah, or somebody posted on Facebook. Yeah.
One thing that I wanted to talk, I think I was going to specifically direct this at Kim, was in the design of Link and of the Yetis. I don't know anything about kind of primate morphology, but am I right in thinking that Link is kind of given a kind of platyrrhine aspect? He's kind of flat nosed, as you'd expect for a New World primate, whereas the Yetis are kind of, or the other way around. I can't remember who's platyrrhine. Is it New World or Old World?
Platyrrhine are the New World monkeys.
Yeah.
Okay, and the catarrhine are the Old Worlds, and it looked like they gave the Yetis who are in the Himalayas a more kind of catarrhine.
They had a
nose.
little bit more of a protrusion on their nose.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Which, if that's the case, if that's deliberate, then that's pretty damn cool. That shows quite a good level of research into the.
Yeah, I appreciated his nose also because it made him look more primate than bear.
Yeah.
Right. Like a lot of times when people draw Sasquatch or whatever, it's either very humanoid with a nose like us or a snout.
Yeah.
Whereas they went with a very primate nose, which I enjoyed.
That's an interesting idea, but I don't think it aligns with the narrative that
No, it doesn't.
Sasquatch and Yeti are closely related, because the idea that Sasquatch comes from Gigantopithecus suggests that they crossed the Bering Land Bridge with all these other animals during the Ice Age.
But this movie didn't say it was Gigantopithecus, so this movie didn't make any claims. But
if they are making Sasquatch Platyrrhine and Yeti's Catarrhine, then that's suggesting that they're not each other's closest relatives and they're separated by, like 80 million years of evolution, because that's how distinct almost the or 50 or 60 million years anyway, that's how distinct the New World and Old World monkeys are.
So we'd be closely related to more closely related to the Yetis than the Sasquatch.
Yeah, and so it'd be a kind of massive case of convergent evolution or parallel evolution in those two lineages.
Yeah, not very parsimonious.
No.
No.
Well, the whole idea that Gigantopithecus was the ancestor of Bigfoot comes from Grover Krantz, the Canadian anthropologist, who in the 70s, I believe, he tried to formally name Bigfoot Gigantopithecus canadensis. And of course, we have the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature, which regulates how we name animals. And they said you can't name an animal without a type specimen.
Yeah. Could you imagine? Like, you're like, I'm a famous scientist and I've named 75 species. I just think of them all. Like,
it's been tried before. So Nessie has a binomial, which is Nessiteris rhombopteryx, which was published in Nature by Sir Peter Scott. And again,
what? How did he get away with that?
I don't know. He didn't have a type specimen. I guess because he was a Sir and it was in Nature. But there's no type specimen.
Well, we should just make up a species then, and let's get a Nature paper, Ross.
Back in the 70s, you could you could find a species like a Nessie or a Yeti or whatever, give it a name, send it into Nature, and then get the paper the next month.
Well, have you guys been following Mariana's new paper?
Yeah, I've invited her to come talk to our lab. I'm excited.
My advisor, Mariana Roxandich, has just published a paper naming a new human species, Homo bodoensis, which I've been very anxiously following all the discussions online, and I'm glad I'm not one of the co-authors on that paper, because when you get a paper that's being talked about all over online, just so much anxiety. I can't deal with that. I want my work to fly under the radar.
Yeah, I've had my work go viral before, and it was super stressful a couple of days. It was fun, but as an introvert, I just prefer to be alone with the bones. I don't want to.
Yeah,
but
yeah, I think that's a sensible attitude.
Yeah, I never read any of the comments. And then my research went viral. It wasn't evolutionary research. It was on Anglo-Saxon identity. And it went somewhat viral this summer. And I didn't read any of the comments except for just to look to make sure that the white supremacists didn't like it. Because when you're publishing on Anglo-Saxons, it's always a worry. And then I just looked up and they did not like it. And it was trending in a bad way with the white supremacists. I'm like, okay,
that's good. Yeah.
Anytime I do research that pisses them off, that I'm happy.
But white supremacists will pick up on anything, because I wrote a paper about Neanderthal fossils that we found. And I found someone on YouTube reading my article about this Neanderthal fossil, and there's this white supremacist movement to claim Neanderthal ancestry because the Neanderthals were the first white people in Europe. So now instead of tracing it to the Aryans or the Atlanteans or whatever, now they're tracing this white supremacist ancestry all the way back to Neanderthals, and it's like, no matter what you say, the white supremacists are going to twist it to fit their narrative.
Well, they did not twist mine. They did not like it. They called me a libtard, and I was like, "That's fine."
You should wear that as a badge of honor.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've had there was when we published the genome of the saber-toothed cat last year, that got published in the Daily Mail, which is a tabloid over here in Britain. And I amused myself greatly by going and reading the reader's comments at the bottom of the article, where, we had generated a kind of reconstruction of this saber-toothed cat hunting some horses, and the Brains Trust that were reading this article were saying, well, I mean, there's a photo of it there with a horse, and horses aren't found in the Americas, so obviously this is all rubbish. A, it wasn't a photo. B, horses are native to the Americas, and they've just got extinct. And there was a whole bunch of people complaining about how what was the point of this research, which was great. I mean, that was really
I get that
quite
a lot.
fun. But yeah, you can't please everyone.
No. Well, for me, when I published on evolution of the human spine, so I got a lot of creationalists, but I just didn't read it because I was like, I'm not like you can't fight that kind of ignorance. Like it's willful ignorance, right? The photograph, that's hilarious. So they have a photograph of it.
Yeah, that somebody wasn't firing on all cylinders that day.
No. Well, it's the same with the people who got angry that Steven Spielberg killed that poor Triceratops when they had him posing with the
yeah, but I mean, back to the film. I thought it had a nice message as well. We're talking about how our kind of research gets misinterpreted and used by horrible people, but I thought it was quite a nice message that often kind of familial relationships don't matter for all that much. Link goes to find the Yetis, and they don't want anything to do with him. They think he's been kind of corrupted by hanging out with humans and making friends with Adeline and Lionel, and so they kind of call him a redneck and tell him to get lost, essentially. And that kind of leads to the kind of climax where they end up escaping, and Link becomes Lionel's new partner, and they're kind of friends for life. Which you can't choose your family, but you can choose your friends. I thought that was quite an unexpected from a film that kind of deals obliquely with kind of evolutionary questions. I thought that was quite a nice kind of counterpoint to that. Doesn't matter who you're related to, you can choose your friends.
Yeah, I thought there was quite a number of good themes. So there was the female character that held her own, and the Lionel was in love with her, and she had left him for his friend.
Yeah,
right. So that's why he was mad at her.
I don't know if you noticed, but right at the beginning, when they're first in his office and he's going through all his drawers to
there's a picture of her.
There's a picture of her, yeah.
Yeah.
And I noticed that.
And so, but she leaves him for his best friend. And so that's what he's still mad at her for that. And he brings that up to her like, well, the reason why we don't talk anymore is because of this. And she was like, well, you weren't a good husband. Like, there was no apologies. There was no like, I'm sorry, like I should have been yours. It was you didn't stand up. So like, I don't regret it. I went with the person who took care, like who was a good partner. And then, obviously her going off on her own later was good. But I also really enjoyed how when the Sasquatch chose his name to be Susan, because he had met a naturalist named Susan and he really liked her. And Lionel was like, but that's a girl's name. And Susan was like, yeah. And then he was like, okay. And they just called her Susan from then on. And so I thought that was really good, especially for kids, to show that, like, now with this, how we're starting to evolve in our thinking of people's identity and choosing their own identity, and it doesn't necessarily have to conform to the Western idea of binary gender types, right?
Yeah.
And I thought that was really nice. How there was no pushback or anything, or nobody made fun of them.
And they respected that. They called Susan all the way through the film, which was a nice touch as well.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned already, but they also take a few jabs at this colonial superiority.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
When he first meets Susan and realizes that Susan wrote the letter, and he says, "You invited me here to discover you," and he's like, "Oh, discover? No."
Yeah.
like this idea, like, how can you discover me? I'm right here.
I wrote you a letter.
Yeah. And later on, when they're in the Himalayas and they're at the end of their map, and what's her name? Adelina, I think is her name.
Yeah.
Says, where do we go from here? And he says, from here, my dear, we will rely on my extensive anthropological knowledge and my keen eye for local custom. And then it cuts to them in the village and he's talking very slowly and loudly in English. Do you speak English?
That's a great gag. It's like the Indiana Jones and the I think it's in the Last Crusade when they send out Marcus and he's got the Grail diary. And Indiana Jones has this great speech about how Marcus he'll slip away and he'll blend in. He knows every language from here to Pashtun. He knows every local custom. You'll never see him again. And then it cuts to Marcus very loudly going, "Hello, does anyone here speak English?"
That's good. I liked also how they had the Tibetan monk greet them with the tongue. And I looked that up because I was like, I wonder, because it jogged a memory, but I couldn't quite remember, and I looked it up. So it's Tibetan monks greet you by sticking their tongue out. And it's to show that their tongue isn't black because they're trying to show that they're not the reincarnation of an evil king whose tongue was apparently black. So that's them showing, like, I'm not evil, I'm friendly. It's by showing their tongue is pink.
Cool.
That's interesting.
I did love Gamu, the Tibetan grandmother with the chicken on her head. I thought she was great.
I love when cartoons throw in things like that just don't matter at all, and they're so weird, and there's no explanation for them. Like, don't bring up the chicken, don't bring up the chicken. And then when they bring up the chicken, she's like, "What chicken?" Yeah. So funny.
Then also, there's another major theme in this movie we see in almost all the movies that we've reviewed so far, which is just that humans are terrible.
Yep.
And they spell this out really explicitly, where the elder Yeti says, "Man, killer of life, of hope, of dreams. Man talks of the magic of the world, but it is a prize, something to be claimed as proof of his worth." I don't think any movie has spelled it out so explicitly that this is what humans are.
I know, and Lionel and Adeline didn't even argue it. Adeline was like, "Oh yeah,
got a point."
Yep.
That's fair point.
And Susan's whole predicament is based on that as well, that humans have been spreading westward and squeezing out all the last Sasquatches.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I definitely say watch this movie. It is enjoyable.
I mean, I kind of read up that it didn't do really at all well in cinemas when it came out and kind of sank without trace, but it is a really good film. Definitely very kind of family-friendly, fun to watch, entertaining for adults as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I watched it with my kids and they liked it.
Yeah.
I felt like there was something strange about the pacing a lot of the time. It's not necessarily slow, but I feel like it's not really paced in the formula of a typical animated children's movie, and so I feel like that might have something to do with it. Had a lot of Wes Anderson vibes, I felt. Which I like. I liked that, but I feel like it just didn't feel like the formula of a typical animated movie, and that might be what people are picking up on. But for that reason, I liked it quite a lot. It was very different from what I was expecting.
A lot of the dialogue was quite dense for a child too. So a lot of the conversations that they had and the words that they were using as a kid, I wouldn't have known what they were talking about. As an adult, but so maybe kids, I don't know, didn't really jive with it.
But I think Susan's humor is really aimed towards kids. This just taking everything literally, I think, would be really interesting from a kid's perspective of learning these idiosyncrasies of language.
Yeah, because kids have to do that too. I mean, they learn language, but they don't learn when someone's being sarcastic or metaphorical or some kind of allusions that they're And I think that's why Link works as a sympathetic character because he is very childlike and kind of naive and optimistic, which makes people makes him endearing to people.
Well, I often take things way too literally too. My family calls it pulling a Kim,
and that's why you endear yourself to people as well.
Yeah. So I can kind of feel his pain. One time, my mom still bugs me about this. On Christmas morning, she handed me her mug, an empty mug, and she said, "Can you refill it?" And I said, "What do you want?" And she said, "Just milk." And so I went in and got her a mug of milk, and I brought her a mug of milk Christmas morning, but she obviously meant coffee with just milk in it. So she still bugs me about that. And I was 30. I wasn't a kid. I was 30. So I poured myself a cup of coffee with milk and then gave her a mug of milk.
Wow. When you were telling that story, I thought it'd be like, this is a story of 10-year-old Kim, not 30-year-old Kim.
No. No. So sometimes I don't know why it's tone of voice. I don't know. I can't explain it. My mind just never thinks beyond. Like it's not like I dwell on it and then I decide that that's what she wants in these situations. It just, that's what she said. That's what she gets. She said just milk. She gets just milk. And I don't move beyond that in my mind. And it happens too often.
It's like that joke of the computer programmer whose partner sends him to the shops and tells him to get a newspaper, and if there's eggs, get a dozen. And he comes back and he's got a dozen newspapers, and she goes, "What's this?" He goes, "Well, they had eggs."
Yeah. Yeah. I've done that to my mom. We're having people for dinner. My poor mom, she puts up with so much. And she said she didn't like the potatoes that she had. I didn't see what potatoes she had. So she had told me to go to the store and get her new potatoes, which apparently is a kind of potato. And so I just went and I bought her the same kind that she had, but new. So I bought her a bag of the same potatoes.
Did you check all the best before dates to find which ones were the newest?
And so I bring them to her and she's just like, "I said new potatoes." I'm like, "They are new. They're just from the store. I just got them." And she was like, "Oh my God, why did I send you?"
Oh, jeez.
My poor mom.
Thanks to David Bach for designing our cover art. You can see more of his work at dkbach.com. Screens of the Stone Age is supported by the Paleoanthropological Society of Canada. Find out what Canadian paleoanthropologists are working on at pasc-scpa.ca.